welcome. When I first started working on this series, the idea that it might one day be at the Museum of the American Revolution was almost like a joke. That, how could a museum of history and something as serious as the Revolution be interested in my very contemporary, very, very queer, very challenging take on history? But I underestimated them, and the fact that I'm here, and I'll explain as we go through it, you'll start to understand why it was appealing to the museum. The first reason is behind me. It just so happens that the museum had been working for a few years on a historical narrative about this gay officer in Washington's army. Baron von Steuben came from Prussia, and he was, absolutely maverick military leader, and Washington desperately needed help. The ragtag troops, as they called them, needed to be whipped into shape, and von Steuben did that job. Now, he was available for hire in part because supposedly he had been kicked out of the Prussian army for his personal life, which was, not allowed. You weren't allowed to be gay back then. So Washington knew about that, but chose to look the other way. That was the first don't ask, don't tell, and, focused on the job. So I had read this, I'd heard about it. One of the decanters is of von Steuben. We'll go there next. And so, I thought this is just an amazing story, but who knows if it's true? Well, the museum believes that it's at least worth discussing. And the philosophy of the Museum of the American Revolution is not to tell you facts, but rather to ask questions, to present data, information, and then let the viewer decide. So this incredible case talks about Baron von Steuben, and was von Steuben gay? He lived with and later adopted 2 military aides. They inherited his estate. There are intimate letters written. There's all kinds of documentation that suggests it. Of course, if you weren't there in person, you'll never know for sure. But it seems to me, my answer is yes, he was definitely gay. He also, this is a total stereotype, but he was a bit of a male peacock. And these are his actual shoe buckles. And if you come closer on our way out, you'll see they're very camp. And yeah, and that is, you can be a peacock and very straight, but it's sort of circumstantial. So anyway, the director of the museum was introduced to my work and saw my von Steuben, and he said, this is really perfect timing because we have our own von Steuben case coming together, and we're going to be showing it during Pride Month. So how cool would it be if von Steuben is presented first as a historical figure, and then follow me to see the 21st century version. This is my Baron von Steuben, and as I wrote on the card here, finally, it's all about von Steuben. So maybe I'll pause and explain to you what are these things and how did I come into possession of them. Back in the 1960s and 70s, whiskey companies, especially Jim Beam, were trying to avoid a whiskey tax that was being levied by the government. Ironically, there was a whiskey tax after the Revolutionary War that did not go well for the government. They ended up having to send in troops to squelch a little mini rebellion that the farmers were initiating. Well, then in the 1960s, there was another whiskey tax, but this time the companies were able to avoid it by packaging the whiskey in decorative decanters and calling them collector's items, collectibles, rather than hooch. So it turned into a huge thing. It was post-war suburbia. A lot of men were, there was little disposable income, and there were all these, home bars and rec rooms with wood paneling and shag carpets. And it just so happens that my fiance over here, Bill, his godmother's uncle had a collection of over 300 of these bottles. Birds of America, the 50 states, cars, and then among all of the other pieces were heroes of the American Revolution. So Arlene, by that point, they'd been in her basement for a few decades, and she was, as we got to know each other better, she's like, John, you like vintage things, you like kitsch. could you imagine using these for anything, in your art? And I definitely was attracted to them. And in particular, I was attracted to these figures from the American Revolution. The idea that they were heroes twice. They were heroes in the 1700s, and then they were heroes again, according to the marketing executives at Jim Beam Whiskey, who decided these will sell, these will be popular. I mean, von Steuben, I honestly had never heard of him before. But clearly in the 60s, for people who were paying attention, he was an American hero. So my process was thinking about these guys and girls and questioning, are they really heroes? Are they heroes today? Based on my values and the things that I believe are important. And how did they feel about gay people and women and blacks and all of the values that I think are so important, and that without which I would not call them a hero. Now, of course, you can't put today's values on figures from the past, but at the same time, as an artist, I do have the freedom to talk about it, to raise questions, to challenge the historical narrative, and in a way to find my own place in history. It's extra loaded for me because I'm an immigrant, a first-generation immigrant. My father happens to be standing right here. We came here from Israel when I was 2 years old. We had accents. I had a weird name, which I very quickly changed from Yaron to Johnny. And I was, trying to find my place as an American. As I got older and also was dealing with my sexuality, being gay, trying to find a way to accept that. And then even the idea that I wanted to be an artist, that was something else that wasn't quite mainstream. It wasn't something that I really could talk about because it wasn't what my father and mother wanted me to do. They wanted me to, have a good job and security and all the things and be happy, of course. But being an artist was just a little outside the boundaries. So there were all these things that kind of separated me from the mainstream, let's say. And by working on these figures, by thinking about American history and layering in my own vocabulary, it was a way of reclaiming my identity as an American. In 1976, we actually became American citizens in the bicentennial year. So it's like there were these stepping stones to total acceptance. And the idea that these pieces are now in the Museum of America's Revolution is like the final step in this journey. So in each case, I was balancing the specific narrative of the figure with more general objects that relate to me, to kind of wishful thinking, giving them pins that reflect the different messages, social action pins, but always starting with things that are specific. So von Steuben, of course, he's holding a pride flag. He has a silence equals death pin on him. All of these sculptures were inspired by monuments. When you go into Fairmount Park and you see the officer on the horse, or in front of the art museum, George Washington on this massive pedestal with animals reclining around it. We'll get to that in a little bit. So I was thinking about what the tropes of monuments, and the pedestal, of course, is the foundation of it. Then you have the figure, sometimes on a horse, sometimes standing. The military ribbons and embellishments, that was a really good fit for me because my day job, I'm a jewelry designer and have been since the 1980s. So using the language of jewelry in my art making is something that gives me a lot of pleasure. It's like a real sweet spot where I can use, jewelry and other kinds of, and charms and pins and embellishments to tell a story, not just to decorate. Here we have a pedestal that's made up of one of the most famous books of the gay liberation movement, The Joy of Gay Sex. I changed it from, I covered the word sex with a rainbow heart. And actually, this is a shout out to my brother who is on FaceTime with us right now. My brother had a whole thing about the idea of of the word homosexual, and he believed that it should be homo-lovual, that it's all about love. It's not about sex. Sex is a part of it, but love is the kind of overarching theme. So, especially in the context of this public museum, I wanted to really reinforce that narrative. So, Lee, thank you. So, it doesn't read the joy of gay sex, it reads the joy of gay love. Some of it it's more intuitive, it's not like there's a literal meaning for everything, but I wanted to celebrate the joy in von Steuben being able to finally come out. So he has a smiley face. There's a pretty chandelier crystal that, added also an element of sparkle and joy. Other political buttons along the flagpole. And then a lot of rainbow hearts on the books. And a shout out to my niece, Lee and Mark's daughter. This little cartoon character, she made it out of clay when she was a little girl and gave it to me as a gift. And that's one of those situations where I can't exactly explain to you why it's there, but it just felt good and light, and it was a connection because I know that my niece made it. It's a connection for me, bringing me into the work. And my hope is that it's not just me, that it's the audience. As you're looking at it, you're going to relate, you're going to identify things, relate to them. There's a paperweight here that says, you got this. And, and my hope is that it'll unlock history for all of us by making it contemporary, by making it lighthearted, by, not being too pedantic about it. The director of the museum said that their goal is for this to not be your grandparents' history museum, to make it relevant and modern. And that's why I think he did, get excited about my work, because it does that with these historic characters who, in general, we're very reverential towards them.
How do you know when to stop?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always think to myself, I'd rather have 10 half-an-hour sessions than one 5-hour session. And every time I come back to it, I kind of do a little check-in with the work. Does it feel, is there enough? Does it feel, does everything make sense to me? Is it too much, And it's rarely too much because I'm a maximalist. But I guess, again, it's an intuitive decision. And it's actually interesting. I've been working on these pieces over about the last 3 years. The earlier ones were simpler than the more recent ones. So even within this one project and the same artist, I'm kind of changing, my eye has changed, and my, what I'm trying to achieve is a little different. So this case is a series of, the big boys, the heroes of history. We have Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Hancock, and Thaddeus Kościuszko. Thaddeus I wasn't that familiar with before, but it turns out he actually ended up in Philadelphia, and in Society Hill there's the Kościuszko House, which is a museum to him. So I'm learning the whole way along. This is not that I'm a historian at all. It's more that I had these figures and then did a little, very basic Google and Wikipedia kind of research to just find hooks into the story. One thing I learned about Thaddeus is that he was from Poland, and he came to the United States to help with the war effort. But on his way, he stopped in Paris and went to art school for 3 years. I can't exactly tell you how or why, but he was an artist, and that really appealed to me. So he has this Art Unleashed button, and I put the Mona Lisa there as a little riff on art school in Paris. I also did this piece in the absolute heat of COVID, and so I thought, in a time travel gesture, if Thaddeus was alive today, well, these COVID tests would be relevant for him too. So that's why there's COVID tests there. There's also, and when you guys get to come look closer, on 3 out of these 4 sculptures, there's a tiny little piece of paper with a number and the person's name. That relates to Monument Lab, which is a Philadelphia nonprofit that is questioning and revisiting the role of monuments in contemporary life, and looking at the historic landscape, and then suggesting modern updates. So one of the things that they did was an audit of the 50 most popular historical figures in the monument landscape in America. So who has the most statues of them, basically. I took that audit, and whenever I had a person who was on that list, I cut out their name and number and added it as a way of kind of speaking to the historical monument landscape that I am now, tweaking. So Thaddeus was number 22 on the list. I was really surprised. George Washington was number 2. So if Washington is number 2, can you guess who number 1 is? No, Lincoln. Very good. And Jefferson is number 10. And actually, this Jefferson has "Monuments Must Change" button on his sculpture, and that's a Monument Lab button. Jefferson also has we have a very complicated interpretation of Jefferson, because on the one hand, he did many great things, on the other hand, he did many problematic things. And again, I can't solve these problems, but I also don't want to ignore them. So Jefferson has a necklace that has a lot of cowrie shells on them, and the cowrie shells are symbols of the African slave trade. So I'm calling you out, Thomas. And same with George. George was a gentleman farmer, but who was doing the farming? So he has a cowrie shell on his necklace as well. Jefferson has a pin, "Virginia is for lovers." That's a little cheeky call out on his reputation as a Lothario and, his relationship with Sally Hemings. He also was the ambassador to France, so there's a French champagne box that's part of the pedestal. You'll notice that a lot of the sculptures have cell phones, iPhones. John Hancock has my dad's old BlackBerry. And the reason that I put phones on all of these things was, again, it's like a contemporary touch that we can all relate to. So if John Hancock was around today, well, today he'd have an iPhone, but, a decade ago, he would have had a BlackBerry. John Hancock, I also didn't know much about other than his famous signature, put your John Hancock here. And as I wrote on the caption, when I was a kid, I was, and again, inspired by my father, who has an amazing John Hancock of his own. I practiced endlessly in notebooks. Lee, I don't know if you did something similar, but I wanted a great signature, an artist's signature. So that was really my entry point to John Hancock. Then I read more and discovered that he was, it was a good guy of history. He was the governor of Massachusetts. He was, thoughtful. He inherited his uncle's shipping business. He used his money in smart ways. So there's little references to the shipping business, nautical embellishments and charms. The Massachusetts piece, there's Massachusetts state flags. There's quarters. I don't know exactly when, but there's a whole series of state quarters that are around. So I actually started buying them online wherever the person was from. As I was looking for embellishments, some of them I've had my jewelry business for decades, and it's kind of a parlor game. Like, do I have this? And the answer usually is yes. But then I also purchased additional pieces like the quarters and the flags. I gave him a quill pen, which actually Bill had. That was your quill pen. I jeweled it up a little bit. The Liberty Bell also, Bill, thank you for that. So that kind of gives you an idea. Another fun thing to point out, I was also, as an artist, I'm always looking for my place in art history. And in this case, it was really fun to use art books as part of the pedestals, or pins or other souvenirs of other artists who I like, which puts me into dialogue with them. So, and then in addition to art books, business books, self-help books. So you have a little of all of that here. Wrench in the System and First Break All the Rules. Those are two, popular business books, and those messages just seemed so appropriate to George Washington. I mean, he was, talk about a startup nation. He had a big job ahead of him. John Hancock is sitting on top of a book that says, "Can Art Aid in Conflict Resolution?" So thinking about the Revolutionary War, thinking about, the role of art in that, and that is exactly what I'm doing. And one more shout out to my father, who happened to have been the editor of that book. So it's all around me. I can't get away from it. Once the museum invited me to have this show, I really didn't want it to be all white men. So I started looking for a little more diversity in the decanters, but I was kind of, my hands were tied a little bit because I was limited to the decanters that were produced in another era, in the 60s and 70s, when, there wasn't as much sensitivity and awareness to diversity. So the two women decanters that I found, this one's not so surprising, Betsy Ross, a mother of our country. Betsy Ross, in my research, didn't necessarily create the first flag, but she definitely made flags. She was an entrepreneur. She was around. She was in the room when it happened. And she was, an important archetype of a woman making a difference in the context of the revolution. So I gave her a couple of books about, the bottom one is about coverlets. The Christie's catalog is a historic textile catalog. The book above that, Making It in America, that's like an entrepreneurship book. The necklace, again, using my jewelry background, almost all of them have necklaces, and Betsy's includes a mom charm. She was a mom of 7 kids, a locket with Taylor Swift's, hand heart on it. A little shout out to my niece, who's a big Swiftie. She has an I voted pin on, a little bit of time travel and wish fulfillment. Philly Love Pride pin, a Smash the Patriarchy pin, a feminist pin. And then I decorated the pedestal with these industrial bobbins that I'd bought at a flea market once years ago, thinking that they would make cool charms for a bracelet or something. Molly Pitcher is not quite as well known unless you drive up the New Jersey Turnpike, and then she's a very popular rest stop. And I was wondering why did she get a rest stop named after her? So what I discovered is that Molly, that wasn't even her real name, but she was a water girl on the battlefield. She carried a pitcher of water to, hydrate the troops. So during the battle, and this is in New Jersey. So during the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey, her husband, who was a soldier, he was wounded and he fell down, and she saw that. She put down her water pitcher and she went and womaned his cannon. And that is what assured her place in history. So this decanter shows her, I don't know what it's called, you're loading the cannon, ready to fight. So I gave her a pin that says, "Fight like a girl." The pedestal includes a book, Modern Women, Smart Women Protect Their Assets. And to really honor her place in history, she's now part of this book, The Best of Life. Another little personal shout out is because it was Bill's godmother who gave me access to this collection, and she was a Jersey girl, a proud Jersey girl. Part of Molly's necklace has a locket, and that locket has Bill's godmother and her husband's photos in it. It was from her jewelry box when she passed away, and also a wedding band was hers. So again, nobody would know that, but it made it personal for me and for Bill, and now for all of you. And it just thinking about this idea of history and famous people from history, and how do you bridge that gap? One other fun little detail is that this Molly was a blonde, but when I read about her, she was a redhead. So I took matters into my own hands and I painted her hair red. Another interesting fact about her is that it's also said that it wasn't about a specific person, but rather Molly Pitcher is every woman who served important roles in the Revolutionary War, including Margaret Corbin, the first woman to receive a military pension, and Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man to fight. So interesting to think about, this idea that there were women in the Revolution. And there were also a lot of Black people in the Revolution as soldiers. The Rhode Island Regiment was famous for being integrated. I really wanted to find a Black regimental soldier or other figure from history, but history wasn't quite that evolved, and there were none that I could find on eBay and Etsy. After Bill's godmother's inventory, then I started looking elsewhere to find more figures specifically about the American Revolution, and ended up buying another 10 or so on eBay and Etsy. So, and I'm still looking if any of you come across any. This is to round up the historical figures. We have two fathers of our country, another version of George Washington, and a Ben Franklin. This was another distillery, and they approach the decanters differently. It's a little more tasteful. You know, it's not the colorful, kitschy painting. They're also larger, so I felt like these pieces could have more presence, more statuesque. Earlier, I mentioned the memorial to George Washington outside the Philadelphia Museum of Art in Aiken's Oval, and the animals along the base. So I happen to have a series of little metal farm animals and trees and gates, and I decided to give Washington that as a pedestal, both reflecting on this monument outside the art museum, again putting myself into this art historical narrative, but also acknowledging his role as a gentleman farmer who had other people do the farming for him. More business books in the pedestal, a little Scrabble game spelling out father, just as a whimsical touch. There's some printer's blocks here, a G and a W. And then the necklace, again, has all kinds of bits and pieces about his life: a cross for his faith, a dog because he loved animals, an M for his wife, Molly, the In It Little Washington, a ribbon that I added to that. That's just a shout out and a kind of reminder of how many things and places are named after Washington. So I happened to have been there once for an event. I kept the ribbon that was, there was a little gift at the table, and made its way into Washington's necklace. And then I forgot to say it earlier, but I've tattooed most of these figures with little metal stampings, or using a gold pen. I've tattooed their hands, little birthmarks on their faces. I don't have any tattoos, but I kind of wish I did. So it's a wish fulfillment thing, and I also thought that it would make it a little more modern and relatable to a contemporary audience. Ben Franklin's piece works with the same kind of principles as George Washington, but Ben Franklin there were so many things I could have done. He invented bifocals. He was a major part in the invention of discovery of electricity. He founded my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. He was a great writer and quipster. So I've got little symbols of all of that. A rare misstep of Ben Franklin's was that he wanted the turkey to be the national bird, not the eagle. So there's a little turkey spaced out between the Pennsylvania quarters on the pedestal. Along with the book that came from a different context, Unmonumental, that was the name of a show at the New Museum in New York a few years ago. I just thought it was so appropriate here because I am trying to create something that's both monumental and unmonumental. And that summed it all up, as well as another little art historical book, putting that as the base of the sculpture, grounds it for me in the history of art. And then there's the audit. He was number 8. Benjamin Franklin was number 8 in the top 50 most frequently memorialized Americans. Finally, not every historical figure from the Revolution that got a decanter was a famous person. There were a lot of soldiers that were also memorialized. The 13 colonies all had regiments that fought in the war. And these regiments were comprised of young men as young as 16 and as probably not older than their early 20s. And they were the foot soldiers of the Revolution. They created history. And when I was thinking about it, well, first of all, because they don't have their own Wikipedia pages, there wasn't a historical narrative that I felt obliged to follow or riff on. So it was a little more of a creative writing project, thinking about these men and coming up with my own story about them. The first thing I thought to myself is, they must have been scared out of their minds. Like, how do they know what to do? How easy would it have been to be killed? It was a very scary notion, and especially when you're that young. I'm sure they would have rather been at home playing with their dogs, listening to music, drinking beer, riding on a skateboard, if they were, if it was a 20th century version, 21st century. So when you come closer, you'll see all of those pursuits and activities are represented through bottle caps, through CD jewel boxes, through speakers. Then I took it a step further and I thought, well, if it was me, and when I was in my 20s, it was all about Madonna and Grace Jones. So the Pennsylvania regimen is literally, it's a pair of them. One of them is on a stack of Grace Jones CDs and the other on Madonna. And I also had in my personal library books about both of them. So I've strapped on, a little reading material for those quiet days between battles. These guys are from Pennsylvania, so there's SEPTA tokens there for them. This is another Pennsylvania soldier, and he is standing on a pedestal made up from two books, The Peter Pan Syndrome, which was about boys who don't grow up, and then a kind of tongue-in-cheek style book called How to Be a Man by Glenn O'Brien. So, I'm trying to help these guys. This is a New York regimen, and I gave him some kind of iconic New York moments. There's references to Broadway shows, the album at the base. What else? The New York Apple, the New York Times, and then again, quarters and flags. The shaving brush is a little reference to, their youth, and that they're probably just at the age where they really have to start shaving. And finally, the Baylor Boys. I'm calling them the Baylor Boys, but it's a pair of Baylor's 3rd Light Dragoon soldiers. A dragoon is a regiment on horseback. I learned that for this project. And I happen to have from my grandmother's curio cabinet a pair of little porcelain white horses that, were just sitting on a shelf at home. So I brought those into service. But then in a more serious way, I decided that the Baylor Boys were going to be, they were going to represent all of the queer young people in the Revolutionary War and throughout history who were not allowed to be themselves, who, on top of all of the other pressures that they had being soldiers and teenagers, they had to keep their truths silent. And what if, since I'm an artist and this is my story that I'm telling, what if they could be truthful and out? And I wanted to help them in that journey. So their pedestals, again, literally come from my own bookshelves at home. It's books about self-actualization, making your own luck, coming out to parents. I'm okay, you're okay. It's sort of a mishmash of pop psychology, personal help, and then historical references, Gore Vidal's Pink Triangle and Yellow Star, talking about the Nazi persecution of both gays and Jews. So this Baylor boy is Jewish, and he has a Jewish star from my jewelry business that has an American flag on it, a Star of David, in addition to his other offerings. When I was making these guys, I felt like, oh my God, I'm a boy playing with dolls, because it's really like just dressing up these little figurines. Each of them has like 6 or 7 necklaces, each necklace with a single charm. That was more of an aesthetic decision, a fun way to approach the embellishment. But cumulatively, both the process for me and I hope the manifestation of it tells a new narrative of these historical figures. I have sold to museum stores all through my career, and very separately, I've pursued my art making. So in recent years, my big goal has been to integrate my art and my business and, find as many synergies as I can. Now it seems obvious, but for a long time, I didn't have that clarity. So as I was thinking about this show, in addition to embellishing all of these figures with a lot of jewelry, I decided to make a series of brooches inspired by what they're all wearing, but make them for people to wear. Really, resin is what holds all of these together. So that's a material that I worked with in my jewelry over the years. when I started making these figures, at first I was just gluing things together with, like good glues out of a tube, but it was obvious that it wasn't enough. That wasn't gonna, these pieces were not gonna last and become part of art history if they didn't stick together, technically. So I did some experimenting, and in my discovery cart, there's one that you can see firsthand. So I ended up with this 2-part epoxy that you mix together, and then I poured it and brushed it over all of the figures. I took the necklaces off first because I wanted them to be, it's almost like dressing the figures at the end with their jewelry. So the necklaces are loose, but everything else is encased in this kind of plastic. There's a million air bubbles at first. It's very stressful. Like you think you ruined the whole thing. I have a blowtorch and a heat gun, and the heat pops the air bubbles. So in a very kind of, in a nerve-wracking dance, you get rid of all the air bubbles. And then I wanted the books to seem a little more book-like and not so shiny. So I sprayed those with a matte spray. So you have a little bit of the contrast between the shine and the matte. It takes it a step further. My mom was a sculptor, and she worked with found objects and created these abstract metal sculptures. And she always did something at the end to unify the disparate parts, whether it was polyurethane or paint or letting it rust outdoors. And I think that was in the back of my mind, how as an assemblage artist, I'm not making things from scratch. I'm working with existing materials. How do you transform it into something truly new? So part of it is the thematic, the narrative, and then part of it is technically by giving it an overall shine. I felt like it pulled it together. So that is Whiskey Rebellion.